very nice to be here and to present this ongoing research to you today. I realize that this topic is not, let's say, nice for everyone. I don't know. It's maybe a little bit complicated sometimes to understand. So just to say, don't hesitate to interrupt me or ask me questions if something is not clear while I speak. Okay, so Amandine already mentioned the title of my presentation, Between Soft and Hard Governance. So they use evolving sustainability reporting framework in an international context. So let's start precisely with the context from where this work in progress departs. And the context of research is, let's say, the growth, especially in recent years, let's say in the last couple of decades, of corporate sustainability reporting practices at the international level, so in many different jurisdictions. What do we mean when we talk about corporate sustainability reporting? I'm sure many of you probably have an idea of what this is, but let's provide a definition. So corporate sustainability reporting means the disclosure by companies of different types, of different size, financial and non-financial companies, the disclosure to relevant stakeholders of non-financial information. You know that usually this is what companies do, right? They report at the end of the year, for example, on their financial aspects, you know, and challenges and expenses. But sustainability reporting is really about disclosure of non-financial aspects of a company's performance, and meaning particularly everything that has to do with the company's action, impact, and risks on a number of topics like environmental, social, and governance issues. So everything about, for example, the impact of a company on climate change, or on biodiversity issues, or on human rights, for example, or workplace relations, right? So a whole range of topics, usually now more and more called ESG topics. You might have heard of this acronym. And so indeed, in the last years, we see this increasing phenomenon of companies reporting along with the financial information, also sustainability information. And this is a result of an increasing demands, right, coming from many different actors, many different stakeholders, demands that companies, you know, do good, let's say, while they're doing their business, right, while they pursue their profits. The demand is that they also, you know, implement sustainability practices, or that keep into consideration their sustainability impacts, for example, right? And at the same time, we see not only this mounting pressure on companies to be more sustainable, let's say, or to disclose information about their sustainability practices, we see also a lot of companies. And now I know that I'm generalizing a bit, but indeed we see more and more companies, not only in Europe, but almost worldwide, we might say, that uptake by their own decision, let's say, that increment their sustainability practices and that disclose more and more information about these practices. Whether, you know, this is about decreasing their emissions, for example, or, you know, their impact on biodiversity, as I was mentioning before. So, in this context, the European Union, indeed, as a jurisdiction, let's say, has been at the forefront, has been really a laboratory of initiatives on, you know, to boost disclosure of sustainability information by European companies, with a number of, you know, pieces of legislation and regulations, the most recent of which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which we will be talking about more later. And this piece of legislation, this directive that we will talk about more later, needs to be placed within a broader regulatory framework that the EU has been putting in place, which is also in line with its broader sustainable finance agenda, which basically means that the EU is taking more and more action to make sure that capital, and funding is increasingly directed towards sustainable investments. And so companies, in that sense, and in, let's say, the financial sector more in general, play a crucial role in order to deliver on this sustainable finance agenda that in turn, of course, is in line with the EU overarching goals of making Europe the first climate neutral continent by 2050. However, the EU is not, of course, the only actor putting in place these rules, these corporate sustainability disclosure rules. In fact, as you can see from this slide, the field, let's say, of the international field of sustainability reporting is quite a chaotic field populated by many different actors, many different organizations. Here you have a glimpse of some of these actors represented by their logos. These are all, of course, different organizations, frameworks, standards that are really about how companies should or can disclose information regarding sustainability topics. Right? Some of these, or most of these standards and frameworks are voluntary, so companies can decide to report information according to these rules. And then we have, of course, many other frameworks that are national frameworks, right? So within states that set disclosure rules, but that I couldn't include in this slide. And we see the CSRD, for example, which is the EU disclosure framework, which is actually a mandatory framework, right? So this is already an important distinction between, what are sort of voluntary guidelines that companies, as I said, can decide to choose. On the other hand, we have legally binding rules, for example, the EU rules. So we can, let's say, for conceptual purposes, we can imagine this world of sort of a contested arena of many different standards, sustainability standards and frameworks that are also obviously addressed to different stakeholders. Some target in particular investors, some target more in general organizations, some are more sort of like the CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project. This is a global platform that allow different types of organizations at different governance levels to disclose their environmental actions. So we have different types of these frameworks, but more or less they all kind of claim a sort of legitimacy, right, in the international sphere in setting specific sustainability disclosure standards. And the thing that sort of also spurred my interest in doing a little bit more research on this is that indeed there is not like one sort of single, agreed framework that is considered a benchmark, right, for how companies should disclose their sustainability information. So it's interesting to see how all these different frameworks build on each other. So they also are very similar in the kind of framework and standards that they set, but at the same time, it's not yet decided, let's say, which one should be considered as a sort of the gold standard of sustainability reporting. In that sense, the EU is, as we will see, is kind of introducing a very complex and very comprehensive framework. Now, before we go further and we get to the kind of research questions that are guiding the research, I just wanted to briefly give you a few more definitions, just to be sure that we are all on the same page, because it's important. I've already mentioned several times the words reporting frameworks, reporting standards. So let's just be sure that we know what these terms mean. So if we're talking about reporting frameworks, we refer to broad guidelines or even approaches, right, that provide entities such as companies with a sort of structure or criteria to identify relevant sustainability issues and report on those sustainability issues in their annual report, for example, right? when we talk about reporting standards, we go a little bit more deeper, let's say, because we refer to all those detailed and specific guidelines, but also like indicators, right? And metrics that build on the general reporting framework and specify much more in details disclosure requirements. So what companies need to disclose. And then I want to also bring your attention to another concept that I might also use later in the presentation, which is materiality, which is a term that is often used, let's say, in the context of sustainability reporting. I don't know if you ever heard of the concept of materiality referred to this context, but basically, so when we talk about a material issue for a company, that a material issue is a relevant issue for a company to disclose, right? So a material issue is an economic, environmental, or social issue on which a company has an impact or may be impacted by, right? Or it may, a material issue is also an issue that can significantly influence the assessment and decisions of stakeholders regarding a company. Let me give you an example. So an example of a material issue that, a material issue that is important from a sustainable point of view could be water scarcity, for example. So let's imagine a big company like Pepsi that relies, so a beverage company like Pepsi that largely relies on water supply, cheap water supply, let's say, for the production of its goods. Of course, in case of water scarcity, this could have a big impact on the company business, let's say, sales, right, for example. So this is an example of a material issue. For Pepsi, water scarcity is a material issue, right? But this is an issue that is material also from another perspective. If we imagine, for example, that Pepsi produces its products in a territory that is close to where, I don't know, for example, communities live that don't have access or easy access to water, for example, right? So let's say if Pepsi would overuse water supply in the territory, then local communities might be negatively impacted by that. So this is also a material issue, not so much from the point of view of Pepsi business, let's say, but it's material from an external, let's say, point of view, from the impact that this could have on local communities, for example. So I hope this gives you an idea of what we mean by a material issue. Climate change is also, of course, notoriously considered a material issue for companies to report on, right? Okay, so keeping in mind the context that we have introduced, so the questions that I'm kind of posing in this article are, first of all, what is the specific EU approach towards corporate sustainability reporting? We've mentioned like this new legislation, important legislation now, but can we identify like the specificities of the EU sustainability, corporate sustainability reporting approach? And expanding a bit the discussion, what is then the EU approach internationally? Or more specifically, how does the EU attempt to shape the international sustainability reporting arena, keeping in mind the myriad of actors, as we said before, that populate such arena. And so the research design, so how to get from the question to the results, let's say. So the research design for question 1, the idea, what I've been doing already a bit, is to carry out a qualitative analysis to trace the evolution of EU sustainability reporting framework by looking at legal texts, but also by looking at press releases, but also studies that have already been carried out on the topic, with a particular focus on the latest policy developments, and we will see why it's important, I think, to focus on the very latest developments to understand what is the EU approach. And for the second question, how does the EU shape the international arena of sustainability reporting, the idea is to do a comparative analysis where I basically compare the EU framework with at least 2 other international standard setters, particularly the standards set by the International Sustainability Standard Board and the Global Reporting Initiative, to see, what are some key differences, what are some key similarities, and whether there is scope for harmonization and alignment between the different rules, because this will have important policy implications, I guess, not only for companies that we will see have to report based on different frameworks, but also for other actors more in general. And so we go to the first question, right? So starting to answer the first question, so what is the EU approach to sustainability reporting? And here it's important to highlight how in the EU, as in many other jurisdictions, sustainability reporting went from being a voluntary exercise, so left entirely basically to companies' decision whether to report or not on their sustainability actions and practices, to a mandatory exercise, right? So mandated through regulation. So when it was still voluntary, let's say, in the EU, of course, this was a sort of form of self-regulation whereby companies could decide what to report, which framework to use to report, and also they, of course, in a voluntary context, companies have different reasons to report information, right? They are not obliged to do so, but they know that as long as there's a business case to showcase their sustainability practices, then it's worth investing, in reporting, right? Or more in general, why do companies voluntarily report? To improve their public image, for example, to say like we are banning the use of microplastics in our products, for example. Or, we are reducing emissions, and they show like the targets that they pose for themselves. So, this is also done as a way to improve public perception, gain legitimacy, and also sort of avoid reputational risk, which is very likely in this case, right? More and more, it's weird if a company, especially a big corporation, doesn't tell us anything about its sustainability performance. Well, stakeholders will not react good to that, right? But of course, we also have a lot of problems in a voluntary context, right? Because the accuracy of information cannot be, well, it can be questioned. Of course, it's very difficult to compare information across companies because there's not one single way that companies use to report. And of course, even worse than that, we have a lot of cases of greenwashing, for example, which is another term you might be familiar with. It's basically about companies declaring to be more sustainable than they are, or providing misleading information to customers, to investors about their sustainability targets and performance, right? So, indeed, we can understand in this context sort of the move by EU policymakers, right? And the decision to introduce a regulatory framework to govern, the way companies disclose information. And this happened in 2014 with the non-financial reporting directive, which was very useful in sort of introducing a legally binding framework that could establish a sort of minimum baseline that companies had to follow when reporting environmental, social, and governance information, but it didn't really introduce a sort of unique standards that companies could follow, right? So companies had to respect and comply with some minimum disclosure requirements, but they could still use any framework that they deemed more relevant to their own business models, let's say. So again, there was a big problem of comparability of information, which is why in 2022, when we come to the latest sort of policy developments, a new sort of directive, which amended this non-financial reporting directive, was approved, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which significantly expands the scope of the legislation. So, as we will see now, many more companies are included in this legislation. So, as I said, it was adopted in November 2022, and it entered into force in January 2023. And by January 2024, member states, will have to transpose the directive into their national legislation. And indeed, it applies to basically all large EU-listed companies. So we're talking about 50,000 more or less companies in Europe. But it also applies, and this is important, to many non-EU companies that, however, have subsidiaries or branches or significant activity in the EU. So not just EU companies, but also many non-EU companies. And indeed, the objective is to sort of counter the flaws of the previous legislation, so the lack of accurate and comparable and standardized information, by, making disclosure requirements more stringent, and establishing European reporting standards. So not just a minimum sort of threshold of disclosure, but establishing clear and detailed reporting standards that companies will be obliged to comply with, right? And what is also very important with this new piece of legislation is that reporting will have to be carried out on the basis of double materiality. You remember we mentioned materiality before, and we provided a definition of the concept. Well, double materiality means that companies will be obliged to report not only on how social and environmental issues create financial risks, for example, and opportunities for themselves, so a sort of outside-in perspective, how, in that case before, how water scarcity is going to create a potential effect, financial effect on a company, but also the other way around, right? The other perspective, the inside-out perspective. So how a company's activities impact the environment and society. And this is actually quite a breakthrough, because even though this double materiality perspective was already introduced with the previous directive, the new legislation really strengthens this concept, which obviously makes it very important to also consider the externalities and the impacts that corporate activities have on the environment. And so it's not just about focusing on companies' financial risks. So let's come to the adoption of these European sustainability reporting standards that I was mentioning. So what happened? The European Commission decided to task another body with the drafting of these reporting standards, right? So a technical advisory body called EFRAG was tasked with drafting these reporting standards. And in November 2022, these drafts were submitted to the Commission. And now, unfortunately, we don't have the time to go too much in details with all these different standards, but what I want to draw your attention on is that EFRAG proposed very stringent, right? Very tight, very stringent standards, particularly saying that most issues like climate change, for example, the impact of a company on climate change should always be disclosed, right? So there cannot be a scenario in which a company decides that climate change is not relevant, for example, to disclose, right? So basically all disclosure requirements EFRAG proposed to be mandatory for companies to follow. However, after the Commission opened a public consultation period, it had a lot of feedback, right? Especially from private actors, right? From the companies, the corporate actors that were going to be mostly impacted by the new rules. And in July 2023, so a few months ago, let's say, when the Commission finally adopted the standards, there were a lot of changes compared to the version, let's say the first version of standards that the technical body EFRAG had developed. And what is important to highlight is that these final standards adopted by the Commission are significantly more flexible and less stringent than what it was previously announced, meaning in particular that companies will be able to decide what is material for them to report. So basically, companies will have to carry out an assessment of what are the issues that are most likely to have an impact on their business models, and what are the issues that their activities are going to impact on, but they can decide through this assessment not to report on an issue. There are also some phase-in provisions, so I don't want to go too much in detail with this, but basically it means that many companies will have more time to adapt to the new reporting standards, so they will not have to implement the disclosure rules right away, so starting from next year, basically. And also some disclosure requirements, which is kind of linked to the first point that I was making, become voluntary. So again, companies are not mandated to report, for example, on their biodiversity transition plans, which basically means for companies to disclose information on how they plan on adjusting and modifying the impact that they have, for example, on biodiversity, in line of the bigger sort of overarching goal of green transition, right, and climate neutrality goal. So here I was sort of wondering then, given the way in which these sustainability standards were adopted now by the Commission, can we consider this as a sort of rollback by the Commission? So is the mandatory nature of these standards significantly, decreased? Yes, the answer could be no or could be yes, right? So this is just to give you an idea of what is the kind of policy debate going on this issue. And so we might answer no, it's not an ambition rollback by the Commission because, well, companies should have the flexibility that they need in order to decide what information to disclose or not, right? So if we think about Ryanair, of course climate change is we can imagine that it's going to be an important material issue for Ryanair to disclose information on. But if we think about a company, for example, selling insurance products, probably climate change is not a material issue to the same extent, right? So you see how behind this idea, the logic behind this idea is that reporting standards should be tailored and should be proportional to the specific characteristic, and organizational characteristics of a company. So yeah, companies should be able to disclose voluntarily, to decide voluntarily whether to disclose certain issues, and sorry for adding another layer of complexity, but this is also important. What the directive says, and the standards in particular say, is that in case a company decides, no, this issue is not relevant to me, I'm not gonna, go through the process of having to report on this issue, they have to explain why that is the case. And also provide a sort of forward-looking assessment, so kind of looking ahead in time, and say whether there is a possibility in the future for a certain issue to become material. So the point is, even if materiality is left to sort of company's judgment, providing an explanation and a forward-looking assessment is already going to give quite some amount of information to customers or investors or other stakeholders. On the other hand, we could say, yes, this is definitely a marching back of the Commission from the initial level of stringency and hardness of the standards, because indeed companies will basically be able to not disclose any information if they don't want to, and with the consequent risk not only of greenwashing but also of green hushing, which simply means that companies can basically be silent about their activities or non-activities, right? And this flexible approach will inevitably come at the cost of better data availability and comparability, which is essential for investors, for example, to decide whether or not to invest in a certain company. And the last point is put as a question, which I also sort of throw back at you in a way, can any company, even the smallest one, can any company nowadays reasonably claim that issues like climate change are not material to them, like that they, that is not relevant for them to disclose information about their level of emissions, for example, or the risk that, I don't know, extreme weather events, for example, can have on a company's operation. So this is an open question. And so, yes, so the EU approach, which I've started to sort of putting a bit together, the different pieces. So far, what I see is that the EU is putting forward a sort of hybrid approach when it comes to corporate sustainability reporting that encompasses both mandatory but also more flexible voluntary elements, right? So we have a mix basically of standard push, for increasing standardization with these new European reporting standards and for hard regulations, but at the same time, we have also a more sort of market-based flexible approach, which is very sensitive to stakeholders' demands. And we've seen this before, when I was talking about the consultation period that the Commission opened after receiving the reporting standards draft. This is a way of saying, well, there was a lot of political pressure, but also probably a lot of pressure coming from stakeholders like companies that did not want these very stringent, standardized requirements, disclosure requirements. And so this is a way to say that the EU is definitely very sensible to sort of one-size-does-not-fit-all approach, right? And to the idea that reporting standards should be proportionate and maintain a sort of level of flexibility depending on the companies that they apply to. So this is not something particularly new, right, to say that this is a hybrid approach, but I think it's a good sort of analytical concept, let's say, or frame to continue doing research on this topic, because it allows us to go beyond a sort of strict dichotomy between, on the one hand, mandatory reporting and on the other hand, voluntary reporting, and to realize that actually reporting always happens in a sort of spectrum, right? And is always a mix, in a way, of mandatory and reporting elements. And now, coming towards the final part of the presentation, I've also started looking at more the external dimension, let's say, so how the EU tries to shape and influence the international arena. And here I would just like to quickly highlight 3 goals that I think are very clear that the EU is pursuing with its approach. And on the one hand, they clearly aims to building on existing sustainability reporting frameworks in its own rules and legislation, and this is said clearly in the legislative text, and to achieve a high degree of alignment of the EU rules and the the rules posed by other frameworks, and this is of course in order to avoid unnecessary fragmentation, right? But at the same time, the EU, even though these reporting standards are now the sort of new kid on the block, let's say, the intention seems to be to clearly set much higher and more tight standards compared to existing international frameworks. Through a bigger scope, we saw the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive has a very broad scope and stringency, and more stringent and ambitious rules. And also, because of what we said before about the fact that many non-EU companies will be impacted by the new rules, we can also see that the EU is trying to establish rules that have a very far-reaching sort of breadth, right? So possibly also influencing other jurisdictions, so companies belonging to other jurisdictions to follow kind of the same criteria and the same rules. So this is just to give you an idea of some key differences that I've started to detect between the EU reporting standards and other reporting frameworks, the Global Reporting Initiative and the International Sustainability Standards Board. Here what is interesting, I think, is that the first one, the ISSB, is a very recent new sustainability reporting framework established in 2021, whereas the Global Reporting Initiative is considered a sort of pioneering reporting institution, was established in 1997, and it's an international independent standard setting organization that helps a number of businesses and organizations to communicate and disclose information on their sustainability impacts. So already we see that compared to these two reporting frameworks, European reporting standards are different, have a higher level of detail and comprehensiveness. They target different stakeholders, and this is, although this is true regarding the ISSB standards, which only target investors, whereas the EU has a much broader approach. And so if you read through the legislative text, it's not just about providing disclosure, providing information to investors, but it's also about responding to the information needs of NGOs, for example, or customers, or society more in general, right? Because everybody has a sort of interest in companies disclosing relevant information. There's also a slightly different approach. So ISSB focuses only on financial materiality, whereas we've seen how the European reporting standards take a double materiality perspective. Of course, the legal character is also different, mandatory in the case of the EU standards, largely voluntary guidelines and standards in the case of the two other frameworks. And then, last but not least, the European standards required a third-party verification of the information that is disclosed by companies, whereas the other frameworks are much more soft in that sense, because they do not require any type of control, let's say, or assurance over the information that is reported based on those criteria. And so, last slide. These are some preliminary conclusions and following up questions that I'm sort of working on based on what I've presented to you already. So is this hybrid approach, right? Mandatory, voluntary, is this the right policy formula? Is this going to boost more disclosure and better disclosure by companies or not? The EU appears to be in a sort of front-running position in setting these very high, tight standards, but it's also very much connected to existing initiatives. However, there is not really clear clarity or guidance on how reporting entities will have to deal with overlaps, because a lot of companies are already reporting using, for example, the Global Reporting Initiative standards, and now they will be obliged by EU law to also report according to European standards. So how will that work? And finally, I'm wondering whether convergence between different frameworks means that in a way this is only possible if the EU sort of waters down the stringency of its own reporting rules to go more sort of towards existing framework, or the other way around. Are international efforts and standards in need to raise the stringency of their standards to the level of EU standards? I know this is a bit, but it's about wondering how more convergence can be achieved between these different frameworks. And finally, because of the importance also of the new standards for non-EU companies, is this a potential for policy diffusion? So is the EU going to try to sort of influence also how other jurisdictions regulate on sustainability disclosure? So I hope that this was not too boring And I'm open, of course, to any questions or comments you may have. Thank you.